I want you guys to imagine something. Imagine that tomorrow morning, every human being on Earth wakes up with the same subtle but profound change in their brain. Nothing looks different, nobody's forgotten who they are. We can still experience happiness, sadness, anger, excitement, love, embarrassment, boredom, and pretty much every other emotion that normally makes up our daily lives. We can still understand the concept of danger, and we can still recognize that a speeding car can definitely kill us, or that fire can burn us, or that falling from a tall building will end very badly, and that certain diseases are worth taking very seriously. There's only one thing missing: the emotional experience of fear itself. At first, most people probably wouldn't even realize what had happened. Fear is not something we consciously think about every minute of the day, and a lot of times even as it's happening. It appears in specific situations, often automatically, and then it just kind of disappears. You might notice that you're walking down a dark street and for some reason you feel completely comfortable. You might hear a loud noise outside your bedroom at night and discover that you are curious rather than alarmed. Maybe you see a large spider crawling across your floor and realize that, although you still don't particularly want it on you, the instinctive feeling of disgust and danger that normally makes you jump away just simply isn't there anymore. You might drive a little faster than usual in your car because the possibility of an accident doesn't produce the same emotional response. You might realize that you have an important meeting in the morning, and instead of lying awake worrying about how it will go, you simply just go to sleep. For many people, the first few days might actually just feel like a personal transformation. A huge amount of ordinary human behavior is influenced by fears that we rarely acknowledge. People are often afraid of a lot of things, like being rejected, afraid of looking stupid, afraid of failing, afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of disappointing their parents, being judged, public speaking, approaching strangers, changing careers, moving to another city, ending relationships, starting new ones. There's so many things people fear. Remove all of those fears at once and millions of people would suddenly find themselves willing to do things they had spent probably several years or even their whole lives avoiding. Someone who has always wanted to start a business might finally do it. Someone who has wanted to ask another person on a date might simply ask. Someone who has avoided public speaking might volunteer to give a presentation. Someone has always wanted to travel alone, but maybe choose not to, and now all of a sudden, they might go and buy a plane ticket. There would probably be an enormous psychological sense of freedom because fear often creates an invisible boundary around our lives. However, we can intellectually know that something is possible while emotionally feeling that we should not attempt it. Without fear, that boundary kind of disappears. This is where the thought experiment that I've thought of becomes interesting because fear is not simply the emotion that prevents us from doing exciting things, but it's also just one of the mechanisms that prevents us from doing incredibly stupid things. Suppose you are walking through a parking lot and suddenly notice a car moving directly toward you. You don't need to calculate its speed, estimate the stopping distance, compare it with their walking pace, and then logically conclude that you should move out of the way. Your body just reacts before your conscious reasoning even has time to catch up. Your heart rate rises and your attention locks onto the car and you move. That reaction is incredibly useful because the human brain evolved in environments where threats often had to be dealt with immediately and very fast. Think of it like this: fear is essentially a biological warning system. It tells you that something deserves your attention right now in the moment. If the emotional component of that warning suddenly disappeared, humans would still be intelligent enough to recognize the danger, but recognition and motivation are really not the same thing. You could understand that a car is capable of killing you without experiencing the powerful internal signal that normally makes you desperately want to avoid being hit by one. That difference could really change almost everything, especially in split-second moments. Consider something as ordinary as driving. Most people already understand that speeding's dangerous, yet the reason they don't drive at extreme speeds every time they get behind the wheel isn't simply because they have memorized traffic statistics. There's also an emotional response to risk. You see a sharp corner and instinctively might slow down, or you approach a busy intersection and become much more cautious. Someone starts driving unpredictably next to you and you create distance between your vehicles. A significant part of driving involves constantly responding to perceived danger, often without even consciously thinking about it. Now, remove any type of fear from the equation. You could still know that driving at 150 miles per hour is dangerous, but the danger would no longer really feel dangerous. That might sound like a minor distinction, but it really isn't. Human behavior is heavily influenced by how things feel, not simply by what we know. We already see this in ordinary life. People know that smoking is harmful and continue smoking. They know that excessive drinking can cause serious problems, but they continue drinking. They know that staying awake all night is bad for them and still do it. Knowing something intellectually does not guarantee that we will act accordingly. Without fear, the consequences could become a lot more immediate for a lot of things. People would probably take a lot more risks in traffic, on construction sites, workplaces, while swimming, while climbing, and countless other situations. Emergency departments could very quickly become overwhelmed by accidents that previously would have been prevented by simple instinctive hesitation, that being fear. The same thing would happen to children, perhaps even more dramatically. A child does not understand danger in the same way an adult does. When a parent tells a child not to run into the road, the child might understand the words but not possess the ability to calculate the consequences properly. Part of what keeps children alive is the development of emotional associations. The road becomes a place where they are supposed to stop. The swimming pool becomes something they approach carefully. A hot stove becomes something they learn not to touch. Fear helps transform abstract information into behavior. Without it, parents would have to rely far more heavily on physical barriers, constant supervision, and detailed explanations. You could tell a 4-year-old that a moving vehicle contains thousands of kilograms of metal traveling at high speed and that the collision could cause fatal injuries. But that explanation does not carry the same force as the instinctive hesitation that normally accompanies danger. Society might have to redesign many environments around the assumption that people can understand danger but don't emotionally react to it. That could mean safer cars, more automated factories, stricter physical barriers around dangerous locations, and increasingly sophisticated systems that prevent people from making very catastrophic mistakes. A car might refuse to accelerate if it detects that you are approaching an obstacle too quickly, or a building might automatically lock access to an unstable area. Industrial equipment could become even more automated because relying on a human worker to recognize and respond emotionally to danger would no longer be reliable to us. In a strange way, a world without fear might become more technologically controlled, precisely because humans would be less psychologically capable of controlling themselves. There would also be enormous consequences for money. Modern economics depend on people making decisions under uncertainty, and fear is deeply embedded in those decisions. People buy insurance because they are concerned about possible disasters. They maintain emergency savings because they don't want to be financially destroyed by an unexpected event, and they fear something like that happening. They diversify investments because they don't want one bad outcome to wipe out everything that they own, thus being caused to fear again. They pay attention to warnings about recessions, unemployment, and financial instability, partly because of those possibilities being very frightening to them. Imagine trying to sell insurance to someone who intellectually understands that their house could burn down but feels absolutely no fear for that possibility. You might still convince them that the insurance is a rational choice, but millions of people would probably decide that they would rather spend the money today than pay for protection against something that might never happen. Even with fear being in our brains, there's plenty of people who already refuse to buy it anyways. The same thing could happen with retirement savings. If people no longer experience fear about the future long-term planning, it could become a lot less compelling to save for the future. Like I said, even though it makes sense to do this, fear can play a big part in actually helping us make those decisions. Financial markets could also become very unstable. Fear is one of the forces that prevents investors from taking unlimited, crazy risks. When an asset becomes wildly overpriced, eventually some investors start worrying that the price cannot continue rising, and their selling can slow the market down. Without fear, investors might become dramatically more willing to chase this kind of things. A stock could rise by 50%, then 100%, then 500%, and instead of thinking that the price has become dangerously disconnected from reality, people might simply see the gains and keep buying. The eventual crashes could be absolutely enormous. However, the absence of fear also creates an enormous entrepreneurial boom. Starting a company is inherently risky. Most businesses fail, and most people are aware of that. Fear of failure stops many people from even attempting in the first place. Remove that fear and you could see millions of new businesses created almost overnight. The same principle would apply to scientific research, art, invention, and exploration. People who previously worried about looking foolish might experiment more freely. Scientists might pursue strange ideas that would normally be dismissed as too risky. Artists might create things that they previously considered embarrassing. People might be much more willing to make mistakes because failure would no longer carry the same emotional weight, and it just wouldn't destroy a person as much. That could produce a very extraordinary burst of innovation as well. Human civilization has always progressed partly because certain individuals were willing to take risks that others considered very unreasonable. Without fear, the number of people willing to take those risks could increase dramatically. The problem is that there's a difference between eliminating irrational fear and then eliminating the ability to recognize genuine danger. A world where everyone is willing to experiment could produce incredible discoveries, but also an extraordinary number of disasters. Politics would also become just as unstable, perhaps even more than they already are. Governments have always relied on fear to some degree, whether that means fear of punishment, fear of war, fear of economic collapse, fear of crime, fear of political instability. Imagine a government announcing a new law and threatening people with severe penalties for breaking it. Normally, the possibility of punishment creates an emotional incentive to obey, but if people no longer experience fear, punishment loses part of its power. This could be devastating for authoritarian governments. A dictator can control a population partly because people are afraid of what will happen if they resist. If millions of people suddenly lose that fear, governments around the world might face enormous waves of civil disobedience. Soldiers might be less intimidated by their commanders, and protesters might be less concerned about arrest. Ordinary citizens might become much more willing to challenge authority as well. At the same time, the absence of fear could make international conflict much more dangerous. Nations routinely avoid certain military actions because leaders understand that the war could produce catastrophic consequences, and a lot of people fear that. Fear of escalation is a very important part of deterrence as well, because the existence of nuclear weapons is perhaps the clearest example to us. The reason nuclear powers generally avoid using them against one another is because they're definitely not harmless, but it's because everyone understands what could happen afterwards and everyone fears what the outcome would be. Remove fear from that system and deterrence becomes much weaker. A leader could still understand that launching a nuclear weapon might result in retaliation, but the emotional force of that possibility would be gone. If the decision-making system remains otherwise unchanged, there could be a greater willingness to gamble. A world without fear could therefore become simultaneously more politically free and a lot more militarily dangerous. For the same reason, crime would also become a lot more complicated. Fear of being caught is one of the reasons a lot of people don't commit crimes. Fear of prison, fear of retaliation, fear of social rejection, fear of physical harm, and all of those things influence their behaviors. Remove those fears and some crimes might become a lot more common, but the effect would not necessarily be as simple as crime increasing everywhere. A criminal threatening someone with a weapon relies partly on fear as well, where the victim sees the weapon and becomes very frightened, which makes them much more likely to comply. If the victim understands the weapon but does not experience fear, the threat becomes a lot less effective. A robber could point a gun at someone and say, "Give me your wallet," and instead of instinctively complying, the victim might simply say no. That could create a completely different environment for intimidation-based crimes. The criminal would also be less concerned about their own consequences. This could make some forms of violence much more dangerous, particularly if the individual also lacks empathy or self-control. But for ordinary people, the removal of fear might produce something interesting. People would be a lot more harder to intimidate. The social dynamics of bullying could change dramatically. A bully can threaten someone because they expect the victim to be afraid. Take away that fear and the threat loses a lot of its power. Relationships would also change in pretty subtle ways, thinking about how much of dating is influenced by fear. People fear rejection, they fear being judged, they fear appearing desperate, they fear getting hurt and losing someone they care about. Remove those fears and people might become a lot more honest. Someone could tell another person they love them without worrying about the response. Someone could also end an unhealthy relationship without fearing loneliness or the outcome. People might be much more willing to have difficult conversation because the possibility of fear and emotional pain would no longer create the same hesitation. But the fear of loss also plays a very interesting role in attachment. We value people partly because we know we can lose them. We worry about loved ones because their lives matter to us. We make sacrifices because we don't want something important to disappear. If fear of loss vanished completely, relationships could become a lot more relaxed, but they could also be a lot less protective. The emotional urgency associated with caring for another person might change completely. This leads to a much larger question: what happens to morality when fear disappears? A significant amount of human behavior is guided by some combination of empathy, social expectations, and fear of consequences. You may avoid hurting someone because you care about them, but you may avoid hurting them because you could be punished, rejected, or hated for doing so. If fear disappears while empathy remains intact, humanity might become much more compassionate in some ways, because people would be less intimidated and more willing to stand up for themselves and others. But if fear disappears without a corresponding increase in empathy, some people could become extremely dangerous. That distinction there is pretty crucial. Fear and morality are not the same thing. A person can be afraid of committing a crime without being morally good, and a person can be morally good without being afraid. The problem is that fear often acts as a backup system. If someone's tempted to do something harmful and empathy doesn't stop them, fear of consequences still might. Remove both and there's very little left preventing that behavior. The disappearance of fear would also fundamentally change humanity's relationship with death. This might be the most profound consequence of all. Every human civilization has had to organize itself around morality. We build houses because we expect to live tomorrow. We save money because we expect to grow old. We invest in education because we expect the future to matter. We do all of this for our mortality. We protect our children because we want them to survive. We build hospitals because we don't want people to die. Fear of death is the only reason we do these things, but undeniably, it is part of the picture. Our morality is something that we always keep in mind. Or our mortality, rather. Imagine knowing with absolute certainty that you will die eventually and feeling no fear whatsoever about it. You could still love your life, you could still want to survive, you could still enjoy being alive, but death would no longer carry the same emotional weight. Some people might respond by becoming a lot more adventurous. They might travel constantly, climb mountains, explore dangerous environments, or devote themselves to experiences they previously considered much too risky. Others might become more focused on long-term goals because they no longer feel anxious about their mortality. Some scientists might spend decades pursuing difficult research without the psychological pressure associated with their own limited lifespan. But other people might become less interested in planning. Why sacrifice today for something that happens decades from now if the emotional urgency surrounding the future is gone? Why save for retirement? Why spend years building a career? Why maintain a stable life? Some people would continue because they genuinely value those things, but others might become far more focused on the present since they don't fear anything in the future. That could create an enormous cultural shift as well. Our current society is built around delayed gratification, though there is a lot of issues with people choosing instant gratification. But children spend years in school preparing for adulthood. Adults work decades preparing for their retirement. Governments plan infrastructure for generations, and businesses invest billions expecting returns years into the future. Fear of an uncertain future is one of the reasons we prepare for it. A society without fear might become a lot more oriented on the present, more than we already are. And that could be both wonderful and very disastrous. It could mean people spend less time worrying about hypothetical problems and more time actually living. It could mean fewer people spend decades trapped in careers they hate because they're terrified of financial insecurity. It could be more people pursue art, travel, relationships, and experiences. But it could also mean fewer people build the infrastructure that future generations depend on. Eventually, society would probably have to compensate. If individuals became less motivated to prepare for danger, institutions would have to take on more of that responsibility. Government might mandate retirement contributions, cars might automatically prevent dangerous driving, banks might impose limits on extreme financial risk, and buildings might become much more resistant to accidents. Technology would increasingly protect people from decisions that their emotional systems could no longer regulate as easily. In other words, us humans might need to gradually outsource fear. Our machines would become the cautious part of our civilization. Your car would effectively say, no, you can't drive this fast, or your bank would say, no, you can't invest all your money like this. Your workplace might say, no, you cannot enter this dangerous area without some sort of protection. Your phone might say you're walking towards a cliff and trying to notify you. The irony is that a civilization without fear might become one of the most regulated and automated civilizations imaginable. There's also a fascinating effect this could have on exploration. Humanity has always been held back by fear of the unknown. The ocean was and still is pretty frightening. The wilderness has always been frightening. Space is very frightening. The idea of entering an environment where humans cannot naturally survive is deeply unsettling. Without fear, people might be much more willing to explore. More people might volunteer for dangerous specific expeditions. Space programs would recruit a lot more easily, deep sea exploration could expand a lot more, and researchers might be willing to enter environments that they currently consider too psychologically stressful. But again, physics in the real world doesn't care whether you're afraid. A fearless astronaut still needs oxygen, a fearless driver can still drown, a fearless climber can still fall, a fearless scientist can still be exposed to radiation. This is why the disappearance of fear would not create invincible humans. It would create humans who are much more willing to encounter the same dangers that already exist in our world right now. And that might be the most important distinction in the entire thought experiment. Fear does not actually make our danger disappear, it just simply changes our behavior in response to that danger. If the fear disappears, the mountain doesn't become safer, the ocean doesn't become less deep, and the bullet doesn't become slower. The disease doesn't become less deadly, gravity doesn't become weaker, the environment stays exactly the same. The humans change. Over time, that would probably lead to a new kind of human culture. Children would be taught risk assessment almost like mathematics. Instead of relying on emotional warnings, people would be taught to understand probabilities and consequences from a very young age. Schools might teach practical risk management alongside traditional subjects. People would learn to distinguish between actions that are dangerous but worthwhile and actions that are just simply reckless. Society might eventually develop a substitute for instinctive fear, a kind of intellectual caution. The problem is that intellectual caution is slower. You can reason through a problem, but reasoning requires time and information and thinking. Fear evolved partly because the brain often doesn't have either. A rustling sound in the bushes might be harmless, but you don't have the time to determine if it is or not. The fear response tells you to pay attention immediately and just react. Without that system, humans would have to compensate through technology, training, and accumulated knowledge. And perhaps that is exactly what would happen. After enough accidents, society might learn. After enough financial disasters, maybe the regulations for finance would change. After enough workplace injuries, maybe safety systems would improve. After enough reckless driving deaths, autonomous vehicles would become a lot more mandatory. Maybe after enough military crises, international institutions would be redesigned. Humanity would slowly build external systems to replace an internal emotion. And that raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps civilization could eventually become safer without fear than it was with fear. Definitely not immediately and definitely not naturally, but after a lot of generations of adaptation. Because once humans understand that they can no longer rely on instinctive fear, they would have an enormous incentive to create systems that prevent dangerous behavior automatically. The first few years would definitely be chaotic. Accidents would rise, risk-taking would explode, financial markets could become very unstable, political conflicts could become very dangerous, people would make decisions that would previously have seemed unthinkable. But eventually humans would adapt, and something else might happen at the same time. The amount of human achievement could increase very dramatically. Think about every invention that was rejected because someone was afraid it would fail. Every scientific experiment that wasn't attempted because it seemed ridiculous, and every entrepreneur that never started a company. Every artist who never showed their work, every person who never asked a question because they were afraid of looking stupid. Fear creates an enormous amount of invisible lost potential. We don't know how many discoveries never happened because the person could have just stopped and been too afraid to try before we knew they were going to make them. A world without fear would remove that barrier completely. People would be a lot more willing to experiment, and they would tolerate failure a lot more easily. They would ask strangers for help, they would challenge authority, they would explore unconventional ideas, take career risks, travel, and create. And because humans are social creatures, the effects could compound on each other. If you know that the other people aren't afraid of judging you, you're more likely to express yourself. If everyone around you is willing to experiment, experimentation becomes much more normal. If failure isn't embarrassing and people try more things, and rejection isn't frightening and people communicate more openly, human culture could become dramatically much more adventurous, but it could also become a lot less stable. The reason societies develop norms is partly because they allow millions of people to coordinate their behavior. Fear is not the only thing creating those norms, but it is woven into many of them. People follow traffic rules because they understand their purpose, but also because they fear accidents and fines. They pay taxes because they understand that public services require funding, but also because they fear penalties. They follow workplace rules because they want to be safe, but also because they fear getting injured or losing their job. Without fear, every institution would have to rely more heavily on rational persuasion, incentives, and physical enforcement. That could produce a society where rules are followed because they make sense rather than because people are afraid of breaking them. Or it could produce a society where rules become much more hard to enforce. Which outcome happens would probably depend on another emotion, empathy. If humans still cared about one another, a world without fear could actually become surprisingly peaceful in everyday social life. People wouldn't be afraid of each other, but they would understand that their actions affect other people. They could become more honest, more adventurous, and more willing to challenge harmful systems. As long as empathy remains strong, removing fear might eliminate some of humanity's worst psychological problems without eliminating our ability to care about it. But if empathy did not remain strong, then the result could be very different. Fear is not the foundation of morality, but it is one of the mechanisms that has helped civilization restrain destructive impulses. Removing it would expose whatever lies underneath. That may ultimately be the most interesting answer to the question. If humans lost the ability to feel fear, we wouldn't suddenly become better or worse, we would just become more of what we already are. The ambitious would become more ambitious, the curious would become more curious, and the reckless would be even more reckless. The compassionate might become more courageous, and the selfish might become more dangerous. The adventurous would explore more, and the cautious would learn to have a completely new way of protecting themselves. And civilization would have to confront a problem that it rarely had to face directly. How do you create a safe society when the people living in it no longer instinctively care about the danger? We might discover that fear was not simply holding us back, but it was quietly organizing a lot of our behavior. It was the reason we hesitated before stepping into traffic, or the reason we checked the lock twice, or the reason we saved money for emergencies, the reason we thought twice before starting a flight, the reason why we avoided getting into a fight, the reason we worried about losing someone we loved, the reason we looked both ways before crossing the street, and the reason we sometimes decided that a particular opportunity simply wasn't worth the risk. But we also might discover that fear was responsible for an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering. It stopped people from pursuing bad opportunities. It stopped people from tolerating unhappy relationships. It prevented people from speaking up when they needed to. It made failure feel catastrophic. It's made strangers feel threatening when needed. It made the future feel like something to worry about instead of something to explore, and so a world without fear would neither be paradise nor an apocalypse. It would be a world where humanity suddenly lost one of its oldest survival mechanisms and had to replace it with something else. Perhaps it would be technology, education, stronger social institutions, or empathy. Or perhaps humans would simply learn, through an extraordinary number of mistakes, how to live without the emotional warning system that had guided them for hundreds of thousands of years. And that is where the thought experiment becomes less about fear and more about what fear has been doing for us all along. We tend to think of emotions as things that happen to us, almost like passengers inside the mind. Happiness feels nice, sadness feels bad, anger motivates us, and fear makes us uncomfortable. But emotions are also information systems. They influence what we pay attention to, what we avoid, what we value, and what we choose to do next. Fear is one of the most powerful of those systems because it takes an abstract possibility and makes it emotionally immediate. You don't simply understand that you could fall. You feel that you should step back. You don't simply know that you could lose someone. You feel the need to protect them. You don't simply understand that tomorrow is uncertain. You feel the need to prepare for it. Without fear, all those calculations may still exist, but they would become colder and a lot more deliberate. And perhaps that would be humanity's greatest challenge during that. We would learn how to care about consequences without being afraid of them. We would have to learn how to be cautious without feeling fear, and we'd have to learn to protect ourselves and without having the ability to feel the panic. We would have to learn how to recognize danger without emotionally experiencing it, and if we could somehow accomplish that, we might discover something extraordinary. Maybe the goal was never to eliminate fear. Maybe the goal was always to become capable of acting wisely even when fear tells us to run, hide, or give up. Because fear can protect you, but if it's too strong, it can also control you. And if humanity ever reached the point where it could separate the useful information contained within fear from the suffering that comes with it, we might achieve something far more interesting than a world without fear. We might create a world where people can recognize danger, understand consequences, and protect themselves without allowing fear to decide what they're capable of. Until then, fear remains one of the strangest contradictions of being human. It is the emotion we spend our lives trying to escape, and one of the emotions that has also helped us survive long enough to build everything that we have. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this thought experiment, and let me know what you want me to cover in the future.